Okay, this is section 2. We're going to talk about sources of growth. So when we're identifying sources of growth, we can identify 5 important aspects of an economy that can help lead and foster economic growth. Number 1, and possibly most important, growth-compatible institutions. All right, I'm not going to talk about that right this second because we're going to talk about it a lot and on the next slide. 2, capital accumulation. So what we need to do here is accumulate the stuff that we use to make other stuff. All right, so accumulate the factories, accumulate the roads, accumulate the equipment, accumulate the human capital as well as social capital that we need in order to have good growth. 3, available resources. This is also very important. We have to have the raw materials that we use to produce the stuff that we produce. 4, technological development. All right, how do we do this? How do we put into practice the knowledge that we have? How do we more productively, how do we make the stuff that we've got make more stuff? And then entrepreneurship. Very, very important aspect in economic growth is this ability and desire on certain individuals to undertake a business venture. So let's talk about each one of these real quickly. First off, growth-compatible institutions. All right, some of the most important things that we can have are these institutions or these formal and informal rules that we use to organize our society. Well, first of all, markets and private ownership of property fosters economic growth. Why? Because it creates the ability to, well, become wealthier based on, well, the ability to do something better than others. So it creates this incentive to create a new product and then market it. 2, when individuals get much of the gains of growth themselves, they work harder. So if we can tie the gains from growth to those who are supplying that growth, all right, if we can somehow reward people for engaging in the kinds of activities that lead to growth, this is important. And we can do this through some of our institutions. Corporations are growth-compatible institution, mainly because of this, limited liability. This is really important. So, for example, let's say you all have heard recently that Toyota had some problems with its cars. Well, they didn't stop. All right. Some people have problems with their cars that don't go. Well, that's not Toyota's problem. They really went, right? They had some issues with the accelerator becoming stuck and it accelerating out of control. Well, all right, that could cause some serious product liability issues. Now, let me ask you this. Would you want to invest, I don't know, say $200 and buy a very small amount of Toyota stock? All right? If you knew that by owning that, the person who sues Toyota over the product liability of their car malfunctioning and accelerating out of control could come after you personally. Well, of course you wouldn't, because as a very small stockholder, you have very little to say over how the company is managed. You probably wouldn't even know or have access to the information to be able to evaluate whether or not this was a significant risk or not. So without that limited liability, it'd be very difficult for you to invest in, say, some of these large companies through the ownership of stock. All right? So this gives stockholders incentive to invest their savings in large enterprises, which allows lots of little savers to pool their wealth together into one big enterprise. All right? Informal property rights limit borrowing by poor and hence limit growth. So if we don't have strong property rights, if we don't have a strong protection of property, then we run into a couple of problems. Number one, because the poor can't have any property, because we have poor property rights and poor protection of property rights, what do we have? They can't borrow and they can't get access to the kinds of resources they need in order to start whatever enterprise they have in mind to start. This is a limitation to growth. It's also a major limitation to investment. So why in general would I want to invest in a factory if I'm not certain that that factory will be, well, mine after I've invested in it? So this protection of property rights is really important. Before we move on, there's one other institution that's really important here, and that is the ability to enforce contracts. All right, having some kind of contract law, having a court system that can impose and enforce those contracts is really important. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us to have agreements between one another. And then finally, a very, very, very important institution that's very necessary is institutions that promote security. So if you have a significant crime rate or significant insecurity within that region, it's going to be very hard to get the types of investment needed to stimulate growth within that region. Why? Because it's a dangerous place to be. Investment in accumulated capital. All right, so one of the next key points is the accumulation of the stuff that we use to produce stuff. All right, so that's what capital is. Capital is the tools, the factories, the knowledge and skills, the human capital that we accumulate and use to produce whatever it is that we're producing. All right, and capital is a very key important element of growth, but it does not necessarily lead to growth. We've got to have all five of these things. We also have to have the institutions. There's some problems with capital. Capital can become obsolete. Capital is much more than physical machines. It includes human capital. Human capital is the skills that workers gain from experience, education, on-the-job training. It's the knowledge that you have inside of your head that allows you to do whatever it is that you do. Social capital is the habitual way of doing things that guides people in how to approach production. There's just more to economics than, well, economics. Right? There's traditions. There's the social biases that we have, and the social inhibitions that we have that either help us down the right road to more productivity, or, well, they can actually sometimes hinder as well. So if we look at accumulation, one of the things that we want to look at is savings. Generally, we think of the more our savings are, the more capital accumulation, the more long-run growth we're going to have. So if we think of savings as the supply of what we'll call loanable funds, this is the loanable funds market. Demand, they're calling this investment, and that's more or less correct. That's the demand for these loanable funds, which ultimately gets used for investment for the most part. If we have increase in savings, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to increase the supply of loanable funds, reducing this interest rate. Now, if we reduce interest rates, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to want to invest more. If we invest more, we accumulate more capital. If we accumulate more capital, we increase our ability to produce, and so we have long-run economic growth. Next, we need available resources. So we can have the capital, we can have the institutions, but if we don't have any of the raw materials we need to produce stuff, we can't produce stuff. So the growth in the U.S. in the 20th century was due in large part to a large supply of natural resources. Generally speaking, larger countries, geographically, have an advantage in this respect than smaller countries. Why? Because a larger country has, well, more ground and more space to have more natural resources. So the U.S. has lots of natural resources, including natural gas. We do have some oil. We have timber. We have coal. We have other mineral deposits. These are all natural resources, as well as a large supply of labor and highly skilled labor. So that's another resource. What is a resource depends on production process of an economy and the technology. So what is considered a resource? Well, it depends on what we need. It just depends on how the economy works. New technology can overcome a lack of resources, but only to an extent. So greater participation in market may increase labor force participation rate. All right, labor is a very important resource. All right, and in the U.S., we have a large degree of highly skilled labor, which is why you see in the U.S. the kinds of things produced that we produce. We tend to produce things that are more complicated. Things that are simple and just basically very low-skilled labor can put them together. We don't tend to produce that in the United States. We tend to produce the things that require a good deal of skill to make. Technology. Technology really is kind of the magic bullet that has really helped us overcome a lot of the difficulties that we have seen in the past. So if you look at a graph of economic output of the world, you'll notice basically up until about the Industrial Revolution it stays pretty flat, and then after the Industrial Revolution it explodes. Why? Because of technological innovation. All right? Essentially, technological innovation means we can do more with the same amount of stuff. We can take the same amount of inputs and get more out of it. So changes in technology and changes in the goods and services we buy fuel growth. Advances, well, of course, as we have more a better technological process, we can produce more with the same amount of stuff. So some very important developments have been biotechnology, computers, and communications have all been extraordinarily important in growth, particularly in the U.S., but throughout the world. Entrepreneurship. The final one we want to talk about is entrepreneurship, is the ability to, well, get things done using creativity, vision, willingness to accept risk, and talent for translating vision into reality. Essentially, the word entrepreneur, it comes from the French word for undertaker. Right? Not like a mortician, although a mortician might be an entrepreneur, but a undertaker, one who's willing to undertake a business venture. All right, and it's some special ability. One of this ability is to get things done without structure, without someone telling you have to do this. All right, you have to tell yourself to do this. Willingness to accept risk. Undertaking a business is a much riskier thing than being an employee and working for someone else. All right? And finally, you really have to have this talent for turning this vision into reality, because essentially you're taking and going from nothing into something. So entrepreneurs have been central to U.S. growth. In fact, most of the new jobs that are created in the United States are created by small businesses. Large businesses don't need to create new jobs. They just need to replace people who have left their employment. So they don't need to create jobs. They just need to take care of attrition. New businesses, small businesses that are growing, they need to increase and have more employees as they grow. Some examples of American entrepreneurs include Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Bill Gates, and really anybody who's willing to undertake a business. So if we look at sources of real GDP growth and part this out, where does the growth come from? We can attribute a lot of growth to technological innovation and a lot of growth to the labor supply that we have. And this human capital goes right along with this labor supply, right? The more human capital we have, the better our labor is. And of course, physical capital. The United States has a ton of capital. It's a very highly capitalized economy.